Well, hello. My name is Ripley Atkinson. I'm the Australian Meats and Livestock Manager for StoneX based in Sydney, Australia, where we're developing price risk management tools for the Australian livestock industry to help the sector manage market and price volatility with our Australian feeder cattle swap. Today, in the Australian cattle and beef markets, we dive into the year of 2025 that has been, reviewing the big moments that mattered, how they influenced the market, and how 2025 can be remembered. The first one I'd like to start off with, though, was a really, I would call market defining and season defining moment. And that was the rain that Australia and particularly the Eastern Seaboard had in late March of 2025. Now, over 50% of Australia's cattle herd is located in Queensland, and rains that fell throughout the month of March in Queensland, in many instances, were record breaking. They were desperately needed and they arrived in a really timely fashion. Though thoughts do go out to those still recovering from the flooding that those rains caused and the impact that that had on them. But I think we can look at that March rain overall as a really impactful, critical um, time or period that really influenced how sort of market demand and prices performed following that. What we saw following that March rain throughout the remainder really of the year, because it was so timely and favourable, it really influenced producer decision making and demand for stock. And this coincided with a period whereby we saw southern regions of the country experiencing quite severe and harsh drought. But in the north of the state, where the rain occurred during March, that really drove increased demand from the producer end of the market, which encouraged additional competition. So, despite the south being dry, they were actually selling cattle into a market where there was strong demand, and that overall really supported prices. I think we can think about that March rain as a really hallmark event of the year, and the influence it had on price performance can't be understated. Moving beyond March, though, as we all know, the 1st of April 2025, the Trump administration had some significant tariff announcements, which really reset the global order and up. It was a really major upheaval in terms of how the world and particularly the flows of commodities and trade was seen. I think Australia's outcome, really, until very recently, of 10% on our exports into America, when we look back at that, we consider it as quite a probably favourable outcome relative to our competitors. And materially, it didn't have a significant impact or any kind of dampening demand on product and specifically beef and red meat exports from Australia into that market. I think what's important to consider about that situation was our tariff at 10% was relatively a fair bit lower than our competitors, particularly places like New Zealand and, of course, Brazil. So, up until very recently, our exports at 10% into the US of that 10% tariff wasn't substantial or material, but we were much lower between what are we now, late November of 2025 and April, and that period when those beef tariffs were on, we were in a strong position. Whereas Brazil, for example, only until last Friday, were experiencing tariffs substantially higher, particularly from August onwards. And what that meant was the demand for Australian product in a market like America was really, really strong. And we're going to see record beef exports into the US in 2025, underpinned by demand for our product, but obviously production, which I'll touch on a little later. The other aspect to think about the tariff dynamic is the fact that this sort of upheaval in global trade order actually allowed Australia to recompete back some of its market share and shift trade flows of beef and red meat around the world. And what I mean by that is Australia actually, or we have recompeted back some market share in our major markets, namely places like China, South Korea, and Japan. China, for example, with its geopolitical tensions with America, have seen a number of several hundred, in fact, processing red meat processing plants closed or their licenses revoked in terms of access into that Chinese market. What that meant was a lack of beef flowing into China from America. So the Chinese have looked to Australia to recognise us as reliable, consistent suppliers of beef, and we've then recompeted back some market share because of another's misfortune. That tariff situation, has created a lot of uncertainty, but I think when we consider it in the broader picture of what it's done for Australia and recognising us a reliable supplier of red meat, particularly when our product is vastly more affordable than America at the minute, beef that is, it's really put us in a good position. Coming back to a local level, looking at price, of course, we can't forget 2025 without considering markets and price performance. What I would say is it's really been a tale of two halves. And what I mean by that is the first half of this year, cattle market prices at a local level were generally quite stable. There wasn't significant amounts of movement in price performance, despite obviously some significant variations in seasonal conditions, and also what I just spoke about, the announcement from the Trump administration on tariffs. But what we have really seen change is a substantial increase in volatility from, let's call it, late June of this year right through to the end of 2025. Over the period of winter, the major cattle regions in Australia saw some well above average rainfall. And what that did was really spur on some demand at a period where rainfall traditionally isn't expected. It's what you'd call unseasonal or not very common. But what the rain did was really drive demand at a producer level to increase their competition to secure stock. But conversely, it also reduced supply. So we saw numbers made available to the market decline, and that coincided with that drought in southern Australia I spoke about, which influenced the availability of cattle that market had. So it forced those southern buyers and this additional competition to come into the major cattle regions to secure stock. And in turn, after some relative stability in the first half, we saw cattle prices rise by anywhere 30 to 50% within the space of a couple of months. Then, in the space of about 6 to 8 weeks, cattle prices declined another 20% off their highs. And again, more recently, we've seen prices lift anywhere between 10 and 20% in the last 3 weeks. That volatility and constant shift and adjustment in price since late June of this year has been a substantial sort of change from the normality and consistency we saw in the first half. Importantly, though, beyond just price performance, I think when we do really consider this year, it will be recognised in an Australian sense for how significant our beef production performance has been. And pretty much on every known record, 2025 will break those records when final figures for the year are announced in February of 2026. But at a top line level, slaughter volumes will reach 10-year highs. We'll have record beef production, record beef exports, record grain-fed beef production, record grain-fed cattle turn-off, and finally, record beef exports to the US. So I think when we consider all of those factors, it's a combination of a couple of things. The first one is the cattle herd reaching 20-year plus highs at over 40 million head as of November 2025, which has obviously made the availability of cattle quite high. But secondly, the productivity of the producer and also the supply chain in general has really driven these results. And it's quite an exciting and really positive outcome across the board. So obviously there's been a lot that I've just gone through and a lot of figures and a lot that's happened. But what does it actually mean? I'd like to wrap it up in really 3 key points. Firstly, it's been defined by a couple of events. Obviously, I spoke on the March rain at a local level or domestic level. That's really been season defining, but also then the global factors such as the upheaval in global trade through the USA tariffs, and then also how that's diverted trade flows or flows of our beef and the capacity of Australia to really define itself as a global leader and a reliable supplier of product. These coupling of these events, I think really mean 2025, that is, can be remembered as an exceptionally positive year for the Australian beef industry. We're producing large volumes of product. Our price performance has been very strong at a producer level. And when you consider the demand for our product, both domestically and around the world, consumers want Australian beef. And I think that's a fantastic result and a great outcome for an exceptional year for the Australian beef industry. That's all for this week. There's obviously a lot to take away in that. But if you want to hear more about, how 2025's performed, head to Apple or Spotify. Every second Friday, I release the Australian Cattle and Beef Market Report, your fortnightly go-to podcast on Australian cattle and beef markets. I discuss supply, demand, price, and other factors influencing the Australian beef industry and how that's relevant to listeners and the global beef supply chain that are involved with the Australian sector. Make sure you subscribe to that report, give it a review, also review this episode or the podcast. But otherwise, thank you for listening. Take care, and we'll see you next time.